Europe is not transitioning to clean energy. Europe is racing against a hard physical limit, and it is losing. If this video passes you by, you will miss the single constraint capable of collapsing Europe's climate plans, its industrial base, and its political credibility in one stroke. No copper means no wind turbines, no charging networks, no electric vehicles, no modern power grids. Without copper, the green transition is not delayed, it fails. Here is the part most people still don't understand. This is not a supply shortage, it is a structural deficit. A gap so large that no amount of policy speeches, climate summits, or subsidies can close it in time. And while headlines were busy celebrating renewable targets and emissions pledges, a quiet $53 billion merger slipped across global markets, dismissed as routine, ignored by most analysts, barely noticed by the public. But behind closed doors in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris, officials saw something very different. They saw a lifeline. They saw the last credible escape route from another catastrophic dependency crisis. Because Europe has been here before. It trusted unstable suppliers, it ignored hard resource math, and it paid the price when energy was weaponized. This time, the stakes are even higher. Miss this story, and you miss why Europe's entire green future is now tethered to a single, unexpected country, and why that dependency is already reshaping global power. Stay with me. What comes next explains why Europe's energy dream is far more fragile than anyone admits. In September 2025, a $53 billion mining merger crossed financial terminals worldwide. Anglo-American and Teck Resources announced their consolidation, framed in the usual language: efficiency, synergies, shareholder value. Wall Street yawned. Analysts categorized it as routine industry consolidation. Markets moved on within hours. But in Europe, the reaction was anything but casual. Energy and industrial officials were not reading the press release, they were reading between the lines. What they saw was not a corporate transaction, it was a strategic signal. A signal that Western copper supply was being consolidated under a jurisdiction Europe could finally trust. For years, European planners believed they could solve energy security through diversification. Copper from South America, processing from Asia, components assembled across multiple regions. On paper, it looked resilient. In reality, it was a fantasy. Chile and Peru, long treated as reliable copper workhorses, are now entangled in political instability, labor unrest, and regulatory unpredictability. The Congo holds vast reserves, but under governance conditions European leaders cannot publicly defend. And China, the elephant in the room, controls nearly half of global copper refining capacity. That last fact changes everything. Europe can mine copper elsewhere, but if China refines it, Europe still answers to Beijing. After the Russian gas disaster, European officials swore never again would energy security depend on partners capable of weaponizing supply chains. Yet by 2024, Europe was one crisis away from repeating the same mistake, this time with copper. The $53 billion merger changed the equation. Overnight, a Canadian-led entity emerged as one of the largest copper producers outside China, anchored by reserves, infrastructure, and governance Europe desperately needed. What markets missed was that this deal arrived at the exact moment Europe realized its options were collapsing. And that realization only deepened when officials looked at the numbers. European Commission documents describe copper as the spine of sovereignty, and for good reason. Every clean energy system depends on it. Wind turbines, solar arrays, electric vehicles, heat pumps, transmission lines, data centers. There are no scalable substitutes. By 2030, Europe faces a structural copper deficit, not a temporary imbalance, but a permanent gap between what the continent needs and what it can possibly secure. Demand for copper in clean energy infrastructure is expected to double by 2035. In some sectors, it must triple. Domestic mining cannot fill the gap. Land constraints, environmental permitting battles, and local opposition make large-scale expansion functionally impossible. Even optimistic projections fall short. That leaves imports, and this is where Europe's green dream collides with geopolitical reality. China's dominance in refining means that even copper mined in democratic countries often passes through Chinese-controlled processing. After the Russian gas shock, this scenario terrifies European planners. Dependency did not disappear, it merely shifted. Internal assessments warned repeatedly, without secure, transparent copper supply chains, the green transition collapses. And if the green transition collapses, Europe faces regulatory chaos, carbon penalties, industrial decline, and political backlash. This is not an environmental problem. It is an industrial survival problem. And as traditional suppliers faltered and authoritarian alternatives proved unacceptable, Europe reached a stark conclusion: it must import or fail. The only remaining question was from whom? That question set the stage for Europe's pivot toward Canada, not because Canada is cheapest, but because Canada is predictable. And in a world of unstable suppliers and weaponized dependencies, predictability has become the most valuable resource of all. After the collapse of Russian gas dependence, European leaders promised themselves and their voters one simple rule: never again build an energy system that could be coerced from the outside. And yet, by the mid-2020s, Europe found itself standing at the edge of an eerily familiar trap. China does not need to own Europe's copper mines to control Europe's future. It only needs to control the choke point: refining. Nearly half of the world's copper refining capacity sits under Chinese influence. That means copper mined in Chile, Peru, or Africa often emerges from Chinese facilities before it ever reaches European factories. From a distance, this looks like diversification. In reality, it is dependency with better branding. European procurement officers understood the danger immediately. If Beijing ever chose to restrict refined copper exports quietly, selectively, or under the banner of domestic priority, Europe's green transition would stall within months, not years, months. Wind turbines do not wait for diplomacy. Electric vehicle plants do not survive without wiring harnesses. Power grid upgrades do not pause politely for trade negotiations. This vulnerability was not theoretical. European Commission briefings explicitly warned that copper refining represented a strategic weakness equal to energy pipelines. After Russia weaponized gas flows, the idea of repeating that mistake with minerals became politically indefensible. Publicly, European leaders spoke of open markets and cooperation. Privately, they acknowledged the truth: Europe was still one supply chain shock away from humiliation. The green transition had created a new form of dependence, one that speeches could not solve and sanctions could not deter. Europe needed an exit. Canada did not enter this moment with grand announcements or geopolitical bravado. It arrived with something far more persuasive: geology combined with governance. Unlike many resource-rich states, Canada offers not only copper reserves, but a system Europe can trust over decades: transparent regulation, auditable environmental standards, legal predictability, and political stability that does not swing violently with elections or street unrest. For European officials, this mattered more than price. Canadian mining projects move slowly by global standards, but once approved, they move reliably. Permits are enforced, contracts are honored, disputes are resolved in courts, not on the streets. Indigenous partnership frameworks provide long-term social license, reducing the risk of sudden shutdowns that plague other regions. The $53 billion merger accelerated all of this. It consolidated Western copper capacity under a jurisdiction already aligned with European regulatory expectations. It created a supplier large enough to meet continental-scale demand without exposing Europe to authoritarian leverage or reputational risk.
This was not about nationalism or friendship. It was about predictability in a world where unpredictability had become the norm. European policymakers began describing Canada in private conversations as the last safe node in the global copper network. Not perfect, not cheap, but dependable. And in strategic planning, dependable beats optimal every time.
Once that realization took hold, Europe's pivot was no longer a debate, it was a process. And nowhere was that process more disciplined or more revealing than in Germany. Germany does not panic loudly, it panics systematically. The scars of Russian gas dependency still define Berlin's strategic thinking. When pipelines were weaponized, Germany faced rationing, factory shutdowns, and national embarrassment. The lesson was brutal and unforgettable. Energy dependence is not an abstract risk, it is an existential one. Yet Germany's green industrial strategy carries a contradiction it cannot escape. Electric vehicles, renewable power, advanced manufacturing all require massive volumes of copper, and Germany cannot mine it at home. As this reality became impossible to ignore, German industry moved first. Copper recyclers, manufacturers, and industrial giants began locking in long-term supply agreements with Canadian producers. Not spot purchases, not short-term hedges, contracts stretching decades into the future. Volkswagen, Siemens, and other industrial champions quietly lobbied for government-backed mineral partnerships. Their message to Berlin was blunt: secure reliable copper or watch Germany's competitive edge erode beyond recovery. German officials started treating copper security as energy security. In internal assessments, Canada consistently ranked as the only partner meeting all post-Russia criteria. Democratic governance, environmental standards Germany could defend publicly, and supply certainty extending through 2050. This was not a pivot towards the cheapest copper, it was a pivot towards the safest copper. Germany was anchoring its industrial future to Canadian geology, not because it wanted to, but because every alternative carried risks Berlin could no longer tolerate. And once Germany moved, the rest of Europe followed. Because when Europe's industrial engine chooses a supplier, it is rarely just a commercial decision. It is a signal. And that signal was heard clearly in Brussels. Once Germany moved, Brussels stopped debating and started redesigning. Over the last 18 months, the European Commission conducted a quiet but exhaustive audit of critical mineral supply chains. Copper emerged as the single most exposed material in the entire green transition framework. Not lithium, not rare earths, copper. The conclusion was blunt. Europe's energy policy had outrun its material reality. In response, Brussels reframed its strategy. No longer was the priority simply availability. The new doctrine emphasized traceability, ethical sourcing, and political defensibility. European manufacturers were no longer asking only how much copper they could buy, but whether they could explain that copper to regulators, voters, and parliaments. This shift eliminated many traditional suppliers overnight. Opaque supply chains became liabilities. Jurisdictions with unstable governance became political risks. Refining bottlenecks controlled by authoritarian states became unacceptable. Canadian copper fit the new framework almost perfectly. Projects could be audited, environmental standards could be verified, contracts could be enforced through transparent legal systems. European negotiators described this privately as copper with a passport. The Anglo-Tech merger accelerated the shift by consolidating scale under a single, trusted jurisdiction. It created a supplier capable of meeting long-term European demand without entangling Brussels in geopolitical compromises it could no longer defend. This was not diversification, it was consolidation around trust. And that consolidation did not happen in a vacuum.
It coincided with a much larger global shock. By the early 2030s, copper is projected to enter structural deficit worldwide. Artificial intelligence infrastructure, electric vehicle production, renewable grids, and data centers are all copper-intensive. Demand is compounding, not stabilizing. Supply, constrained by geology, permitting, and politics, cannot keep pace. This is not a cyclical squeeze, it is a long-term scarcity. China, despite controlling refining capacity, depends heavily on imported ore. The United States is attempting to rebuild domestic production, but faces decade-long timelines. Europe, as established, cannot mine domestically under any realistic scenario. That leaves a small group of countries capable of scaling supply under stable governance. Canada sits at the center of that group. South American producers struggle with political volatility and social resistance. African producers face infrastructure and governance challenges. Australia focuses primarily on Asian markets. Europe recognized the opening. By securing long-term contracts with Canadian producers now, it avoids future bidding wars, price shocks, and diplomatic vulnerability. This is why contracts are being signed through 2045 and 2050. This is why European battery manufacturers are investing directly in Canadian mining projects. This is why European financial institutions are exploring funding mechanisms tied to Canadian mineral infrastructure. The competition for copper is no longer about price, it is about access. And access is becoming power. Which brings us to the final consequence of Europe's pivot. For decades, Canada was treated as a peripheral player in global energy narratives, a supplier, not a strategist. That era is over.
Copper is no longer just a commodity. It is a strategic asset that underpins climate commitments, industrial competitiveness, and energy resilience. By becoming Europe's preferred supplier, Canada gains influence far beyond trade balances. European climate targets now depend on Canadian extraction timelines. Industrial expansion depends on Canadian permitting stability. Energy infrastructure depends on Canadian logistics and ports. This does not mean Canada controls Europe, but it does mean Canada now shapes the conditions under which Europe succeeds or fails. For Ottawa, this leverage arrived quietly, built through regulatory discipline, infrastructure investment, and what can only be described as strategic patience. Canada did not promise speed, it promised reliability and delivered capacity when others faltered. For Europe, the trade-off is clear. Dependence has not disappeared, it has changed form. Instead of reliance on unstable regimes or opaque refiners, Europe has chosen dependence on a partner it trusts, even if that partner sits an ocean away. In a fractured global system, trust has become the rarest resource of all. Europe did not achieve energy independence, it achieved something more realistic, survivable energy security. The green transition was never only about technology, it was about materials, supply chains, and political resilience. When those realities collided with idealistic planning, Europe adjusted, not toward perfection, but toward stability. The question was never whether Europe would import copper, the question was from whom. That question has now been answered. A $53 billion merger that appeared routine marked a geopolitical realignment hiding in plain sight. Europe rewired its energy future around Canadian minerals, Canadian governance, and Canadian predictability. In a world defined by broken promises and weaponized dependencies, achievable security beats impossible independence. Canada did not seize this moment with speeches or slogans, it arrived prepared. And as global competition for resources accelerates, this realignment is not the end of the story, it is the beginning. Because when supply chains become power, every alliance leaves a trace, and the world is shifting faster than most people realize.